Good morning. Um, Today I'm going to talk about the history of climate change, the very brief history of the climate education, and what's its impact on us today. So how many of us can truthfully say that we know sufficiently about the climate crisis and its damages? 100% people, you guys know anything about it? If we're honest with ourselves, even people who have fancy professional degrees and doctorate degrees do not understand the climate crisis adequately. It is inevitably an understanding that we acquire through experience. In a world where climate-related catastrophes impact people in numerous different ways, we're gearing up for this fight. But like a sensible person told me once, you never bring a knife to a gunfight. As a climate activist looking to tackle this crisis in my community, I was intrigued when I began to question, why such an urgent crisis not being taught to everyone? Why is it only mentioned to students when they enter a certain grade or get to a certain age, if at all? I was frustrated. The climate is warming, our homes being destroyed, and yet we're preparing our children for it with coloring sheets and fake initiatives to recycle plastic bottles. Now, I wasn't just frustrated, I was infuriated. For many of us, we learned about the climate crisis through its heavy presence on social media or through the news. But again, why wasn't this information being taught directly by our educators? I distinctively remember reading about it in a science textbook when I was young, being so curious. While attempting to satisfy my curiosity, teachers met me with, "You're too young to learn about it. And we do not know more in depth on that topic." My first response was, why not? When you turn away a curious and ambitious child like me, it only sparks more curiosity. So I went to learn. I found that in 1957, Humble Oil, now ExxonMobil, first learned of the rising CO2 levels. They began to uncover precisely what rising CO2 levels in our atmosphere did to our planet. For decades, they put money and research into research on the effects humans had on the planet, and their companies contribute to climate change. In other words, they knew. While some governments and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations have now started to realize that we need to educate people on the climate crisis, we still have a long way to go. One problem is that companies are allowed to influence policy, including education policy. For example, ExxonMobil has created an initiative to promote STEM learning in communities where they drill for oil. What a very ironic way to show your gratitude. Instead of addressing the concerns of people living in those communities, they educate their children on how what science tells us about climate change is wrong. Exxon continues to drive this narrative by lobbying policymakers and regulating what can and cannot be said about the human effects on climate change. This corrupting influence has prompted some educators, regulators, and legislators to limit what we can say about climate change and mark it as controversial or personal introduction. However, there's also very strong support for an enhanced and improved education on climate change. Actually, 3 in 4 Americans agree it should be taught in school, and a full 86% of U.S. teachers and 80% of parents support it. A majority, and if it was a political issue, as they say, a majority of both Republicans and Democrats also support educating young people on the climate. However, even though an overwhelming amount of Americans, teachers, and parents support teaching of climate change, actually getting it done is a little more complicated. Even though many parents support climate change, only 45 and 42% respectively talk to their kids about it. Even in college, students argue they're not being prepared about climate education. A full 80% of students say that the courses do not prepare them for climate transformation. While professors may not have time, resources, or knowledge to incorporate this into their already crammed schedules, Exxon, the main problem is the curriculum and textbooks. Remember how Exxon was promoting STEM learning? These companies are influencing policymakers, state, and legislators as to what to include in the climate education curriculum. For example, in that same town where Exxon claims to be promoting STEM learning, textbooks refer to climate change as superficial and containing errors. Governments and states cannot allow the fossil fuel industry to influence education policies. Simply put, Exxon needs to be removed from Congress and state houses across the country. As I conclude, tackling the climate change must begin with education. If we do not quite understand what the threat is or how to prevent it or prepare for it, how will we ever be ready? It's like swinging blindly at something but not knowing what you're swinging at. Climate change is an exponential threat to mankind, and we cannot let it fester any longer. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels today and change our industry and workforce to be 100% renewable, carbon emission free, and 100% renewable, and carbon emission free, we will still not reverse the damage that's already done. But we can prevent it from getting any worse. We must prepare our economies to be sustainable, our energy to be renewable, and create green, high-wage, good-paying jobs. This is not a small task. It would take all of us, but we have the tools if we want it badly enough. Now all we need to do is